Okay, what's up YouTube? This is Nick, coming back at you with another FHIR video. Today I'm going to talk about one thing that I think is super critical to getting started with FHIR and understanding how FHIR works, and that's references. When you dig into FHIR, you'll notice that you can't really do a lot with one resource on its own. You need to hop between resources and get multiple resources, and the method of doing that is references. Now, a classic example of a reference, it's on the patient resource, and there's a property called general practitioner. What that looks like in the docs, you'll see a little icon here that looks like a link, a little arrow coming out of it. And the data type is called reference. So you'll see it's a reference, and in parentheses, it will have the resources that it points to, or it's allowed to point to. In this case, this is a cool one because it can point to multiple things. You can point to an organization. So maybe you don't actually go to one particular doctor. You just go to a clinic and you get whoever's there that day. It can point to a practitioner, or it can point to something called a practitioner role. And that's kind of a more complicated resource, but it's a combination of practitioner, organization, some other stuff. Now what that actually looks like, so let's say this is my JSON here. Underneath that property, I have another object, which has it can have 4 properties. All these are optional, but you should have at least one of them to make it work. The first one is called reference. Second one is called type. Third one is identifier. And the last one is called display. So working our way backwards, display, it's just a human readable string. So if I want to, reference my practitioner, I can just say, Dr. Fake Riviera. And again, you might use that for showing to an end user. If you don't want to actually resolve the resource right away and go fetch the data, you can just say this was the doctor and leave it at that. Next, the type will just be the type of resource that it points to. So in the case of general practitioner here, this is actually an array. And let's say I wanted to loop over all the references to figure out, okay, which one of these are actually practitioners, which ones are organizations. Maybe I want to do a map or a filter or something. This would just be practitioner. Okay. And then you get into the actual complicated part of making a reference. So conceptually, there's 2 big kinds of references you need to know. The first one uses the reference property, and the other one uses the identifier property. If it's using the reference property, it's what's called a logical not a logical reference. This is a logical reference over here. And this is a literal reference. Okay. So when I say literal, this is the FHIR term for it. It means you actually know the identifier of the resource you're pointing to. There might be reasons you don't know that, in the case you need to use a logical reference. But first, let's talk about literal references. There's 2 ways to do it. The first is called the canonical reference. And in computer science terms, canonical means sort of the one immutable mathematical source of truth. So for, let's say, a patient, maybe that patient's record is housed at a particular health system. The canonical reference would look something like https://FHIR.healthsystem.com/patient and their ID. More commonly, you see canonical resources used for resources that provide sort of terminology and structure to FHIR. So things like value sets and code systems. In fact, there's a whole class of resources that have a URL property where you're sort of encouraged to just hard code the canonical URL within the resource itself. Again, the idea being that you can sort of build this global network of information sharing, and that the canonical resource URL is accessible from the outside. So if I want to go say look up administrative gender codes, I can just hit that and learn about what that value set does without having to have any kind of predetermined relationship with the server that actually hosts and defines it. Now the second kind of literal reference is called a relative reference. And you'll see this, I think, the most when you're dealing with EHR systems and the like. And what that looks like is just the sort of FHIR part. You just throw away the HTTP, the protocol, the host, and any other kind of junk in front of the actual FHIR part. And it's just a reference to the resource. So in this case, patient ID, maybe practitioner slash 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The idea here is that keeping track of all of those front parts, say like the canonical URL, can actually be really difficult. So one large EHR vendor actually started by only doing canonical URLs and switched to doing relative URLs in, I think, when they upgraded to R4. Now you can imagine, yeah, keeping track of canonical URLs is very, very hard. It's much easier to just say, okay, well, you know, I have the IDs in my database internally. I'm just going to put a reference in, and it's just, you know, pointing to the patient or pointing to provider. I don't need to worry about sort of the canonical source of truth. It's all relative in no short terms. So we'll kind of cordon those off. That's the literal reference. The next kind of use case is sort of places where you don't know what the actual resource you're pointing to is. Let's say I'm a reference lab and I have a COVID test result I want to send for a patient to a place where I don't actually know what that patient's FHIR ID is. But I might have information like their driver's license number. So identifier is a identifier FHIR data type. Typically you'd use two properties on there, value and system, where value is just the ID. So this is my driver's license number, and system is the sort of code system that the identifier comes from. So maybe it's like, you know, PA driver's license. There's actually like a really long UUID for that. But if that patient is in that system, and that system has recorded the driver's license number, theoretically this logical reference can be resolved to a literal reference, you know, assuming that the lookup is there and you have an index on it and all these things. I've used this a lot in the past when writing to FHIR servers where you're using an external identifier. This happens a lot when you're ingesting external data, and you're creating a FHIR resource in one process, and then creating another FHIR resource in another process. And you don't know, you know that resource has been created, but you don't actually have to cache the ID or anything in the middle. You want to just point to it using an external identifier. So it's pretty powerful. Okay, finally, there is one last kind of reference that's important to understand, just so you know what it is when you see it. And they all start with this pound, hashtag, hash mark sign. And this is for contained resources. So contained resources are worth their own video. But what you need to know is that if you ever have a resource and you have some additional information that belongs in a resource, but you don't necessarily have enough to make a resource out of it, you can put it in a contained property. Every resource supports this. And what this is an array of sort of other resources that should be shipped along with the resource. Each thing has to have an ID in here. And if that ID is 1, 2, 3, and then I have my reference down here, let's say GP, I put the pound 1, 2, 3, and you should know that it points to that contained resource. Just watch out for the pound sign. If you get just a naked pound sign hashtag, it actually points the other direction. So that would be a case where a contained resource has a reference to its parent, and it's just saying go back to the top. So if you ever see that, check it out. There's much more reading to do on contained resources and how you should handle them. And we'll make a future video for that, I promise. All right, catch you later. Thanks for watching. Like and subscribe, and have a great day.